Well, hello everyone. How are you doing? I hope you are having a fantastic day. I am in a rush. I just got out of the shower, but it doesn't really matter. I'm going to go ahead and go live anyway. We're going to talk about this week in patriarchy news. Now, normally, for those of you who are regulars, you'll know that we tend to focus on kind of highbrow stuff and more academic articles. We've just finished up doing some things on the evolutionary origins of patriarchy. We also looked at an article that challenged the notion of the male hunter, man the hunter, and women as gatherers, and replaced that, basically provided actual evidence that women hunted a lot in all over the world in many different communities, and that foragers, rather than gendered roles of hunters and gatherers, or at least implied gendered, we should use foragers instead. So that's the kind of stuff we've been doing in the past, but today I thought we would go a little bit lighter and look at the way in which patriarchy still is in operation, particularly in the US, and to examine the ways in which it's operating and also being resisted. And I want to look at a recent vote in Ohio and the reaction to it. Also the protection of drag shows coming out of Florida, and the accusations often leveled against the trans and drag community versus the reality of who is actually the source of the sexualization and predation of children, which honestly, you can find more examples in churches than at drag shows. So let's start by going over my pyramid of patriarchal oppression. For those of you who recall, I brought this up a couple of weeks ago. Oh, this is a little bit, I can see it's bigger than the screen. So I'm using this color. I have to find a different color scheme. Green, I don't like green, but this brown was okay. And what I mentioned, and I'll mention it at the start of the show, is that not currently, my opinion, the reason why patriarchy as a conceptual framework for analyzing power relations has been inadequate and has kind of fallen by the wayside is because of the way that the historical framing of the concept of patriarchy buys into the false gender binary. It not only buys into it, but it reproduces it by accepting it. So in the simplistic false gender binary idea of patriarchy, men, it's a structure of men trying to control women. And that is incredibly inaccurate and therefore inadequate. What patriarchy, in my observations, really is about, it's about controlling everyone's sexuality, their gender identity, their sexual orientation, and their sexual activities. Also, it is an attempt to control reproduction and control the location where reproduction happens in the bodies of non-binary trans and cis people. That's what patriarchy has always been, but I think, at least for me, the challenges to the social construction of gender, especially brought to light by trans activism in the trans community, illuminated the flaws of traditional notions of patriarchy and their limitations. So if we reconceptualize the oppression and the attempts at control as a wider swath of human sexuality, basically all human sexuality, then you realize that men are also victims of patriarchy. Cis and trans people are victims. We're all victims of patriarchy. Now, there are a very small group of heterosexual cis, usually majority group men who also align with the same people who have economic control, who have political control, who have religious control, and to some extent maybe social control. So controlling other people's sexuality is merely another way of extending that and trying to impose a set of values of oppression on a large group of people for the benefit of a small. Because we all know, looking from history, that the people who have gotten away with sexual perversion, sexual predation, and adultery throughout history have been the cis heterosexual men in a society. They always have the most sexual liberty while trying to control everyone else's. And so if we look, we can see that, as we noted in the evolutionary theory of patriarchy, patriarchy starts with threats of violence and sexual violence, and the actual violence itself. That we can see from the evolutionary tradition is where it comes from. you cannot have patriarchy without violence. Those two are inherently linked because patriarchy is an outgrowth of violence done by one particular sort of group to another. Now, in the human societies, we don't just have, as they do in other primates, sort of like a limited amount of social group cohesion and the use of physical violence to various ranges, because we see from the evolutionary theory of patriarchy, patriarchal structures are not given. Different primates have come to different power arrangements within their social groups. And so patriarchy is not natural, it's not normal, and it's not a given. It is a choice by some imposed on by the others, and then we're conditioned. How are we conditioned? Well, by having patriarchal values infused, especially in our religious communities' beliefs and writings. So these values are biological essentialism, which is a lie, the idea of male supremacy, which is also a lie. I mean, just because you can do things physically doesn't mean you're better at everything. It's buying into and justification of hierarchy, which we still see in religion. Religion is very anti-democratic. And it's also, again, about controlling sexuality in order to maximize, a certain notion of who is the right sort of man, although men are always asked to prove their masculinity over and over and over again. They'll never be able to achieve it. So patriarchy sets them up for failure. So there's homophobia, transphobia, misogyny, misandry, the assumption that men are inherently violent and will engage in violence to protect themselves. All of these norms that are put into a culture then go on to get a buy-in from people who are subjugated. Also, if people question it, they are marginalized and pushed to the sides, right? And so that is how those values precede formal social structures that we've seen. And then over time in history, we've seen increasingly formal, legal, economic, religious structures that all reflect back these toxic values by giving power to a limited group of people, by excluding certain types of people, by forcing other people into the closet. And that those public sphere norms obviously get reinforced in the home. If you're raised in a religion, you're taught that homosexuality is a sin and evil. Well, then if you don't question that, if you don't come into contact with gay people or arguments about sexuality that force you to question it, then you're going to go ahead and reproduce that in your own lives, in the private sphere. You're going to condition your children to be homophobic. And then that comes down to individuals. So we see a whole structure, self-reinforcing, also cooperative structures that seek to oppress people. And the trans movement, the gay rights movement, feminism, to a certain extent too, we talk about the civil rights movement and, disability. There's a whole bunch of intersectional places here. So I don't want to limit it to one group. But when it comes to human sexuality and human sexual behaviors between consenting adults, which is something also that patriarchy doesn't value, is consent or adulthood, especially in fertile young reproductive age teen girls. They are very much a target and sexualized by these types of movements. So I can't remember, but all of this works together, right? And we can see how those critical theory movements, those critiques of power, those questionings of givens, pointing out the ridiculousness of claiming the man says no as a form of authority. Who cares if a man says no? He's just a man. Anybody can say no. So these questioning, this pushing back, this marrying of liberation movements with the values, in particular of America. Let's say I'm going to come at that because I'm an American myself, and that's my framework. Then it's hard to claim for individual liberty when you're trying to oppress people. This was part of the rhetorical difficulties that America found itself in when they were called out for their slavery, when they were called out for their segregation. And I think it's been pointed out that there's been no reforms that haven't helped white people. There haven't been civil rights reforms that didn't also benefit white people. In this case, the moral stain of having been the inspiration for how Hitler decided to design his policies based on how Americans treated Black Americans. So, with that framework, let's have a look at some recent news that I think is important and because it demonstrates the resistance to patriarchy and also the counter resistance, the pushback, right? The attempts to protect patriarchy. So happily, on November 7th, we saw a real victory for abortion rights in America. Ever since Donald Trump appointed judges who promised to protect Roe v. Wade as super precedent and then quickly to overturned it, the anti-choice movement has worked hard to try to eliminate abortion rights and even to restrict the movement of pregnant people within their states, as we'll see maybe in a different episode. I can't cover everything in one day. But they have found that, honestly, it's not a surprise that Americans are voting to protect abortion rights, because if you look at the polling, it goes back. Americans overwhelmingly have supported abortion rights with some limitations for decades. It was far easier for the far right to use gerrymandered districts, to use low turnout elections in order to put in elites that would put in policies that were not actually popular. We see that a lot, that political elites get elected by a radical, in the right, radical group. We very rarely see radical leftists getting elected to office. We get a lot of Christian nationalists. We get a lot of dangerous people. Pew abortion attitudes in America. So it's hardly a surprise that when you put something on the ballot, something that has overwhelming popular support is going to get a majority of the votes. So it's not very long. Sadly, I wish they had ones going back farther. But views on abortion from 1995 to 2022. I mean, for me, being as old as I am, that doesn't seem very long. I'd like to see it go back to the 80s. But for an internet search, I guess that's good enough. So as you can see, people who wanted abortion legal in all or most cases versus illegal in all or most cases have always been above. I think they dipped down to 47%. So it was almost tied, but still higher on the point estimate than the illegal in most cases, which got to 44%. I think that was the highest. Yeah, it looks like 44%. They've never reached even 45% on a point estimate, which, I mean, the confidence intervals between, let's say, 3 or 4%, they don't actually give a margin of error because they're probably pooling a lot of individual polls, which would adjust the margin of error for every time point. So they're not going to be able to give a margin of error. But the point estimates show that ever since, the question has been debated, well, at least since the mid-90s, people support access to abortion. And it's now higher than it's been, at 61%, 60% back in 85. This is sort of the Clinton era, 56, blah, 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 blah. Yeah, 61%. That's almost 2/3, right? That's not far off of 66%. So it's not at all surprising that when you put these things on referendum, then yeah, people are going to vote for rights. People aren't going to okay, so I was going to say, people aren't going to vote to take away rights, but actually that's not the case. So I'm old enough to remember Karl Rove using, am I flashing every once in a while? I'm sorry, I have to check I just reset up my computer after having been away for a while. I'll need to check the connections afterwards. So if I flicker, my apologies. But Ohio voters, voted to protect abortion rights. And I don't know if you followed this very quickly, but Ohioans, a few weeks ago were presented with a referendum that said 50% plus one is no longer what it's going to take to get a state constitutional change. Instead, we want to raise the threshold to 60%, right? Because they want to make it harder for the popular opinion to succeed. These are anti-democratic forces at work. This is what it looks like when people are trying to institute a Christian nationalist government. They want 40% of the people or 30% of the people to determine how the rest of us live. This because they think that they are imbued and endowed with certain special rights and powers given to them by their gods. Well, here's the thing. Faith is a private matter. It's not public policy, right? And they are learning this the hard way. Kansas had this vote recently, and now we also have it in Ohio. So the referendum, I'll just read it out, which Ohioans passed by 57% of votes, established a constitutional right to an abortion, overriding laws passed by the Republican-dominated legislature to dramatically restrict access. So hey, victory for democracy, right? The voice of the people is the voice of God. Democratic legitimacy is what separates America from totalitarian governments. It's American exceptionalism, the will of the people, blah, 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 blah. No, not according to Republicans. I think a lot of Americans would agree with that statement, but clearly Republicans don't. They don't care about democratic legitimacy. They don't care that they have to make better arguments or that they have to moderate and mediate their positions in order to attract a more centrist voter. America is a two-party system because we have winner-take-all elections. As long as we have winner-take-all elections, then generally parties, rational parties, are supposed to be going for the median voter, appealing to that middle voter. And if you continue to appeal only to your extremes, excuse me, you'll see, as Republicans have, that they don't do well unless they cheat. And cheating is getting harder and harder as the courts are siding against them, fortunately. So, 27 members of the Ohio General Assembly, after the referendum passed, signed a statement arguing that abortion rights fail to mention a single specific law and vowing to do everything in their power to prevent the restrictive abortion laws on the books from being challenged. 4 of them went even further, circulating draft legislation to give the legislature, right, that they've gerrymandered all of the districts in order to prevent true democracy, exclusive authority over implementing the constitutional amendment at the exclusion of the courts. Now, for those of you who don't know, the system in America is that the legislature writes the laws, the executive vetoes or enacts the laws, and the courts interpret the laws. But they don't like that because it takes away their power source. And because they've cheated by gerrymandering, they have to locate everything in the legislature in order to make sure that the executive and the judiciary can't actually enforce democratic principles. So the move is the latest attempt by some Republicans in the state to use their iron grip on the legislature to push anti-democratic efforts. The legislature has for years declined to heed a 2015 ballot measure prohibiting partisan gerrymandering and attempted in August to make it harder for voters to directly affect policy through referendums. So here's the thing. You've got a fascist party and an anti-fascist party. It seems to me that as imperfect as the anti-fascist party is, it's still better than giving up, voting a third party, and getting fascism. So this is like a little, so right now, this is story 1 in our review of patriarchal oppression. Let's look at another case where the courts are intervening in order to protect people's rights against Christian nationalists. In this case, Ron DeSantis and Florida Republicans, who really want to take away everyone's democratic rights and instead impose their theocratic worldview on everyone. So the Supreme Court declines Florida's request to enforce an anti-drag show law. The law makes it a crime to admit minors to a show that the state deems too sexually explicit. So the U.S. Supreme Court on Thursday rejected Florida's bid to enforce a state law that targets drag show performances that, challengers say, imposes unlawful restrictions on free speech. And it does. I remember many decades ago when the Supreme Court decided that exotic dancing is a form of free expression. Now, exotic dancing does have a reason to have someone who is 18 or over, mostly because men have criminalized women's breasts. I mean, if exotic dancers were shirtless men, it wouldn't be a problem. But it's the criminalization of women's nipples or feminine nipples that, or perceived nipples that are perceived, in any way to be on a female, body or presented in that way. Basically, like if there's a boob, it's criminal. And that is not what happens at drag shows. That is not what happens at drag shows at all. I've seen lots of RuPaul, and I just want to say, like, it's fabulous. It's not sexualized. It's fabulousness. But this is another way of lying lying and misrepresenting and projection is another way that Christian nationalists seek to get control over people's lives. They want to regulate what you can, what exists in their space. The court, divided 6-3, with conservatives dissenting, of course, turned away an emergency request from Florida officials after a lower court blocked the law statewide. The majority did not explain its reasoning. The measure, widely seen as part of a conservative campaign against LGBTQ sick plus rights, was passed this year, sick as in SIC, not SICK, as in they've made an error here by not having the plus, was passed this year by the Florida legislature. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, who is seeking the Republican presidential nomination and has frequently leaned into culture war issues, signed the bill into law. DeSantis this year also signed into law a bill that restricts transgender health care because they are trying to criminalize the transgender community out of existence because they're freaking fascist Christian nationalists who oppose freedom. They don't support it. Officially dubbed the Protection of Children Act, which is not. The law makes it a crime to admit a child to a adult live performance that the state deems sexually explicit, which, really, the state deems sexually explicit? Honestly, how are people dressed up fabulously in clothes that you can wear on the streets? Fine. Sexually explicit. So yada, yada, yada. Good luck. I wish the defendants in this case who are trying to protect free speech all the luck in the world. But I just want to point out the hypocrisy of trying to protect children, right? This whole demonization, false demonization of trans people is just a way for them to ignore the real source of child predators, organized child predators rings and pedo protection rings, which are churches. Churches have had more criminal activity, more sexual exploitation, more predators than any drag show ever. Right? This isn't even like debatable. Children are not safe in churches. They are not safe in churches. They are safer, much safer at drag shows than they are at churches because priests and pastors and religious leaders have spent decades abusing children, exploiting children, and the state, and more importantly, the church authorities, have done nothing. It's taken how many decades and how many people coming forward and being threatened by the Catholic Church, being threatened by the Mormon Church, being threatened by Southern Baptist pastors. You can just go down the list. There is no Christian faith in America that does not have a sexual abuse scandal and a community that idly did nothing because they wouldn't doubt their pastor and they doubted the victims. So let's cover the real area of public life where kids are in danger, and that is from sexual predators, and that is in churches. An Ohio priest was sentenced to life in prison Friday after he was convicted of grooming 3 boys and taking advantage of their opium addictions to force them into commercial sex, according to the U.S. Justice Department. In May, a federal jury in Toledo found the not reverend child predator Michael Zacharias, a Roman Catholic clergyman, guilty on 5 counts of sexual trafficking and allegations that spanned 15 years, from 2005 to 2020. Now, remember, 2005, I want to bring this back to the whole referendum thing. Rick Santorum, another RS guy. Rick Santorum was on Newsmax or some crazy pro-fascist channel, moaning about the result in Ohio, saying that when you put sexy things on the ballot like abortion and weed, because abortion's not sexy. I mean, again, this just shows the disconnect between men warped by patriarchy and patriarchal values to like the reality. Then you're going to get a big turnout, and that direct democracy is not a way to run a government. Yet in 2004, Karl Rove and the Republicans were putting same-sex, were putting marriage equality on state ballots, counting on people's homophobia and Christian desire to oppress gay people's rights as equal citizens in America to a referendum, right? When they think that the numbers are in their favor, they will use the tyranny of the majority in order to impose their worldview, a tyranny of the minority, a majority on the minority. And likewise, they're also willing to try to grab minority power in order to force their worldviews on the majority. It doesn't matter. Like, they always want to weaponize state power in order to control people to live their Christian lifestyle. When I'm not a Christian, maybe you're not a Christian, maybe you're a Christian who disagrees with them. It doesn't really matter. The fact is, private faith is no basis for public policy. You know, the whole, if you don't like gay marriage, don't get gay married. It's easy. But in the meantime, this is happening in the churches. And they're not looking at that. They're not demonizing the sexual predators who preach to them from the pulpit every Sunday. They're not taking another look at the institution that is moving predator priests from parish to parish, or the Southern Baptist Church that is telling domestically abused women to stay with their partners. That isn't questioned at all. The evil in their own homes is normalized, while other people's rights are demonized. So I don't, like, if Ron DeSantis wants to protect kids, then bar anyone under the age of 18 from going into a church. That is going to prevent more sexual predation and more sexual abuse than trying to keep kids out of drag shows. Because drag shows are fun and entertaining, and religious institutions are breeding grounds for sexual predators and abusers, and also for normalizing violence in the home and violence against women and, you know, all that other stuff. Right? So that's how those things go together. Now, for today's last comment, I'm just going, oh, hey, hi, nobody understand how power works. Yeah, Andrew, I get that. Of course, power works differently in every place, but you have to understand how power works in your own community, in your own system, if you want to work within it to reform it so more people can participate. Now, I said this was the U.S. edition, but honestly, I had to cover this as well because I wanted to, it was such a powerful link between toxic masculine norms that are encouraged and perpetuated by patriarchal norms, leading to death, right? Leading to terrible policies. And in this case, Helen McNamara, who is a Tory herself, but one who also lives in a post-feminist, for this post-first and second wave feminist world, and who has access to concepts like toxic masculinity and toxic masculine cultures. The idea that the old boys club is not a good thing, but actually is very bad. The other thing that I think this points to is, sorry for coughing, everyone, is it gets us back to Hannah Pitkin and her seminal book on the concept of representation, right? And that representation happens in many ways, and that they have different approaches. So I think there are 4, but the ones that I always think about, 4 ways of representation, let's look it up, are substantive and descriptive. No, descriptive coming first. Pitkin concept of representation. Because I think there's also like symbolic and yep. What do you mean Hannah Pitkin he? Oh, Griffin begins before since I think. All right, Hannah Pitkin's definitely woman. All right, this is not going to work out. We have another political representation. Yes, formalistic, descriptive, symbolic. All right, so let's have a look at that. We'll go to Stanford. Stanford's always a good source. They do a pretty good job. All right, so let me do a quick find search for substantive, because that'll probably, yes. All right, Pitkin, all right, identifies at least 4 different views of representation: formalistic representation, descriptive representation, symbolic representation, and substantive representation. Let's see the chart below. Formalistic. Institutional arrangements that precede and initiate representation. Formal representation has 2 dimensions: authorization and accountability. Authorization, the means by which a representative obtains his or her standing, status, or position. What is the process by which a representative gains power, and what are the ways in which a representative can enforce his or her decisions? No standards. So I think in terms of formal representation, maybe one could think about party selections, right? In the UK, you've got candidate selections by the parties that are then put on the ballot for the voters. In the US, you have primaries. So that might be a way of thinking about it. Again, I tend to lean on descriptive and substantive more than symbolic or formal. All right, symbolic representation. The way a representative stands for the representative. That is the meaning that a representative has for those being representative. So what kind of response is invoked by the representative in those being represented? Representatives are assessed by the degree of acceptance that the representative has among the representative. I would imagine that for instance, looking back, Kamala Harris's selection as vice president had a deep meaning for a lot of women of color and Black women in particular. And I know that because they talked about it on Black Twitter back when it existed, and the importance of seeing someone who looks like them. Right? We can also look at the Supreme Court and the importance of, of course, white women always go first because privilege and the way power is structured, but Sotomayor and other women being represented, not only just being there themselves, but being a member of the community that also looks out for the community's interest. So who's that guy who just lost the governor's race in Alabama, was it? The Black Republican candidate. Was it the guy the white guy who just won Bavers or something? I can't remember, but anyway, the guy who was running as the Republican, he was Black. He had also been Attorney General when the Breonna Taylor case happened, and he chose not to pursue criminal charges against the police officers involved in her murder. And as a consequence, the Black community did not come out for him because he did not represent them. So being a member of a community in and of itself isn't sufficient if the community itself doesn't feel that you are representing their interests. And this is a community two, so this is like a power up, this is from ground up perspective. Descriptive representation, the extent to which a representative resembles those being represented. And I think it might be a little bit easier to think about descriptive representation not only as individuals, but as whole communities. So again, we're not talking about merely having a token person of color, or a token woman, or a token gay person, or a token trans person, or a token disabled person. We're talking about, like, does the representative body actually look like the people it's representing? So representative discrimination, or representative representation is important in that, you have a mirroring, but that doesn't necessarily mean the interests of the community is going to be advocated for. We get on to beyond mere appearance to substantive debates and substantive representation in the next one. And that's substantive representation. The activity of representatives, that is the actions taken on behalf of, in the interests of, as an agent of, and as a substitute for the represented. The reason I'm going to bring all this back into the Johnson government macho toxic culture disaster is that I wanted to separate out this idea that if you just put people who look like people into a room, yes, you have attained descriptive representation. I think maybe a good example of differentiating between descriptive and substantive representation is looking at how communist nations would put a lot of women, like they would have a third of the body as being women representatives or something like along those lines. But when it came to actually giving them power, running committees, giving them, assignments, giving them the ability to make policies on things that weren't associated with the home. That being, you have sexist men who thought they were all called cool liberators, and they put a lot of women into the representative body that they had there, okaying whatever it was. But rather than giving them actual power, they put them on, health and family committees. This happens in the West too. Like it's not merely, but I want to talk about the real difference between descriptive and representation. So even though it looked numbers-wise that there were more women in this legislative body than there were in the West, their substantive representation was much lower because they were mere window dressing. They weren't really there to enact policies or challenge patriarchy. They were there to be a band-aid on patriarchy and not change the system. So substantive representation is an interesting kind of dilemma when it comes to descriptive representation, in that you actually can substantively represent any group. Like anyone could, in theory, substantively represent the interests of a particular community or a group if you are there and you are a vehicle for getting their values out, for being their voice, for speaking to their experiences and their needs, and for advocating on their behalf in spaces of power. So you can have cis white heterosexual males substantively representing the gay community, while you can have right-wing members who are gay, not substantive, who are descriptively standing in for that part of the population, but not substantively representing them because they buy into, they've got, internalized homophobia, for instance. And they try to rationalize homophobia and homophobic policies, maybe trying to, justify them through religious belief. So descriptive representation is incredibly important because, you can't be what you can't see. And I do think that having a population in power that looks like the population you're representing is far more democratic in terms of its legitimacy, or more legitimate in terms of a government and its government policies, than having a body that looks only like 30% of the 30% of the population, which are like Christian white men. You can double that if you want to add women, but let's just say, because it's disproportionately like Christian white men who hold power in the United States. However, mere descriptive representation does not guarantee substantive representation. And that's what I kind of wanted to get here and tie this back, because having Helen McNamara in the room was important. But her presence, she challenged these toxic norms, and did sounds like some substantive representation, but they don't always go hand in hand, and you don't have to be a member of a group to represent their interests substantively. So from a political theory point of view, I think that that's an interesting framework for understanding the complexity of representation, which is how, we can't have direct democracy. It does get really super, boo, independent. No, I don't want independent premium. Boo, boo, boo. All right, like someone give me, I saw a copy of this on, what was it? Like Sky News, but I really don't want to use Sky News. All right, let's just paste in her name here. Yeah, see if we can get one. Otherwise, I know that there's some videos on this, but we'd have to. All right, Guardian, also not ideal. I know it's not very pro-trans. I hope they reform their views in the future, but for the sake of being quick. Right, a lack of a female perspective in number 10, which is a bit too essentialist. I don't like it. I think it's better, instead of lacking female perspective, I think it's obviously better to focus on the narrow toxic norms that were created by the men who were occupying power, and that they weren't thinking substantively about representing anyone else's needs. So O'Connor presents an extract from McNamara's witness statement in which she said the lack of female perspective created a problem. Going on. She suggests, there was more focus on issues like shooting and football than a domestic abuse or pregnancy as a result. In terms of the policy response, the exclusion of a female perspective led to significant negative consequences, including the lack of thought given to childcare in the context of school closures. There was a serious lack of thinking about domestic abuse and the vulnerable, about carers and informal networks for how people look after each other in families and communities. There was not enough thinking about the impact on single parents of some of the restrictions. There was a disproportionate amount of attention given to more male pursuits, or traditionally male pursuits under a patriarchal structure. In terms of the impact of restrictions, then the lessening of the same: football, hunting, shooting, and fishing. There was a lack of guidance for women who might be pregnant or were pregnant, and what those who were key workers should do. This was particularly significant in education and the NHS, given the demographics of their workforce. The restrictions around birth and pregnancy care seemed unnecessarily restrictive and were comparatively slow to adapt. I never understood this. Although I appreciated the need to keep hospitals as secure as possible, I'm sure there would have been kinder ways of managing pregnancy and birth, especially given the differential clinical outcomes for women and their babies who become stressed. Patriarchy kills. And it kills in many ways, right? It kills through homophobic attacks and dehumanization. It kills through transphobic attacks and dehumanization. It kills through the... there we go. The narrow framing around male interests and pursuits at the expense of, or traditionally male interest and pursuits, around the perceived, around the actual needs of people who are, feminine or trans or mothers or vulnerable in any way outside of their experience. And yet, rather than being open to those voices, rather than thinking about quality representation by having descriptive and substantive representation, when these policies were being developed, this was an old boys club who just thought about themselves. And it literally led to people dying. So, I mean, it's not even like patriarchy kills, whether it's by not requiring consent as a norm for relationships, whether it's minimizing domestic abuse, whether it's turning a blind eye to the abuse, sexual abuse, and other exploitation of children because it's done by religious leaders. All of this stuff, transphobia, homophobia, all of this leads to death. And until we understand the root core values that are driving these policies and attack them at their roots and question the humanity, the decency, the fundamental morality of this worldview, and present alternatives to it that are healthier, more inclusive, more respectful of people's rights and bodily autonomy, and sell that, I think this fight's going to continue. So, oh my gosh, I went so much longer. I usually try to keep this to less than 45 minutes so that you don't have to look at an ad. I'm really sorry. I will just quickly say hello to some people in the chat. So hi, Faye Queen Corey. I can't wait to hear your voice later today. Hello, Andrew. Thank you for stopping by. Dimitri, it is so good of you and kind of you to stop by. Thank you. Kentucky. Oh, who's okay? Matthew, thank you for stopping by. It is good to hear from you and see your face. And yes, and that's what I wanted to elevate and talk about today. I wanted to bring these stories and connect them all to my patriarchal pyramid of oppression and demonstrate that, amongst other things, oppression exists in this particular form, and it is oftentimes covered by religious liberty. But your religious liberty does not entitle you to tell other people how to live. All right, I see I'm flickering. I really got to sort out I took my laptop with me to the States, and when I set up, I clearly didn't plug everything in correctly. So rather than doing that mid-show, I will do it afterwards. Thank you so much for your time and attention, for stopping by and spending time with me. I have been Kristi, you have been awesome, and I wish you a wonderful day, wherever it is and whenever it is you are in the world. Okay, and now I'm going to look over and click the button and say goodbye. Goodbye.